trouble coming? Are we going down? Mother, daughter, and your brother too. Get your mind straight when it's up to you. Hey, you gotta see the storm a-coming.
Hello, this is Reflections of an Uncommon Common Man. Today's date is June the 15th, 2020. I'm here with my co-host, Jimmy Catrone, and my producer, Connor McDaniel. And before I get into the meat of the program today, I wanted to encourage you to go to whitehouse.gov. Let the president know how you're feeling. If you're against all this craziness going on out here in the streets, call him, write him. You can email him through that website, and that's the fastest way to get a hold of him. Just let him know that you're tired of this stuff. You want it to end. But don't allow your eyes to fool you. What you're seeing right now is an illusion. All the people protesting in the streets, police chiefs, corporations, mayors, governors, the media, and celebrities that are pandering and talking crazy stuff do not represent us, the silent majority. Contrary to what you may think, we are still the majority holding awesome power if we'd only willed it. Regardless of how you vote, the color of your skin, or your ethnicity, most Americans are dismayed by what they're seeing right now, and they want it to stop. The majority of Americans will never side with the mob. If we don't get the radical minority under control, we will no longer be the silent majority. We will be the silenced majority. Before I get into what I want to talk about today, I want to make it clear. One of the reasons I named my podcast Reflection of an Uncommon Common Man because I take pride in being a common man. And really, the ones that I want to reach the most are the common people of this country, the ones that need to know what's going on in this country. And when I talk about what I'm going to talk about today, I want to try to show you how the Democratic Party has been so destructive in American history. And it's still destructive today. It's kept that tradition alive. And there's a common thread that runs through the Democratic Party from its founding early on in this country by Andrew Jackson, and even you could even go back to Thomas Jefferson. There's a common thread of how they have demagogued the common people like us, have divided us. At first, up until the 1960s, they divided us on race because they had a different constituency. Their constituency was the white man. Their aim was to keep America white, or keep the Democratic Party white. Then it changed in the 1960s, and they got a new constituency. It's black and white. And so they've had to appeal to a different constituency, but it's the same message. It's a message of division. They use the same tactics today that they used in the slave days, they used in the segregation days, the lynching days, all the way up to now. It's a tactic of dividing Americans. And so when I talk about the Democratic Party, I don't want you common men or women out there. When I say common, I don't say that in a negative way. I say that as the average person that is a Democrat. There's a lot of good Democrats out there. There's a lot of good, decent, patriotic Democrats out there. I was a Democrat. I was a Democrat until I was in my 30s. A lot changed. A lot happened to make me change my mind about things. It was that I got deeper into the Bible. I was learning some spiritual truths. So my values changed. I'd understood that the Democratic Party had turned radical in the early 70s. But I was naively hoping, that it would be a temporary change. They were going through a phase. And I really wanted to see a moderate Democrat come along, or at least moderate to conservative, that I could vote for. I didn't want to vote for a George Wallace type who had stood for segregation in the 1960s. I was more of a Senator Jackson of Washington State, that type of Democrat. And he was not a racist. He was just a moderate to conservative type of Democrat. He was patriotic. He was pro-military, pro-law and order type of Democrat. Type of Democrat that doesn't really exist anymore. But anyway, all through the 70s, I was hoping for a change. I voted for Jimmy Carter thinking that he was the change I wanted, not once but twice. And I found out that he was Obama light. He did a lot of things that damaged this country that Obama took to a higher level during his presidency. And so when Reagan came along, he made me realize that I was a conservative all along. I just didn't know it. And I was able to break free of the Democratic Party. I shook the dirt off my feet and turned my back on the Democratic Party. I've never looked back. My goal here is not to convince you to become a Republican. I'm not totally sold on the Republican Party. That's why I call myself a conservative. When I vote, I go to the polls and vote. I vote Republican simply because there's nowhere else to go. Occasionally, if I find a conservative independent, I might vote for him for a smaller office. But for president, usually I vote Republican because that's the only choice I have. And so basically, I'm just trying to make you as the common man, the common Democrat, realize that I'm not attacking you. When I say Democratic Party, I'm not attacking you personally. I'm attacking the leadership of your party that know better, that should know better. And they're leading you down the path to destruction. They're leading this country down the path to destruction. So I want to get started on, let's go back to, first of all, there's a myth going around among the left today, and they're pushing it. Corporations are pushing it. I think it's called the 1619 Project. The reason they call it that is because they're trying to instill in American youth that America has racism in its genes, that it started in 1619 when the first slaves stepped off the ship at Jamestown, Virginia, and our country has been based, its foundation has been based on slavery and racism ever since. I beg to differ with them. I'm a 1776 man. I believe that this country started on July the 2nd, 1776. I say July the 2nd because everybody gets it wrong. We really approved Declaration of Independence on the 2nd of July, not July 4th. But that's neither here nor there. This country was founded on the principle that all men are created equal. Did we have equality at the time? No. But one thing you got to realize about the founding, you had slave owners and you had abolitionists. John Adams was an abolitionist. Benjamin Franklin was an abolitionist. Benjamin Rush was an abolitionist. Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner. But one thing that sets Thomas Jefferson apart from many slave owners, he believed when he wrote all men are created equal, he believed that. He was a hypocrite, yes. He owned slaves. He didn't free the slaves. He only freed the slaves that belonged to Sally Hemings or in her line. But that was the only slaves he freed. But where he and John Locke differed, John Locke, who Thomas Jefferson wrote almost word for word what John Locke spoke in his second treatise of government, that all men are created equal, but John Locke did not mean chattel slavery. Thomas Jefferson did. When he said all men are created equal, he meant slaves also. The difference between Thomas Jefferson and John Locke was that Thomas Jefferson realized that it would not happen in his lifetime. He was writing a post-dated check to the future. Now, if you don't believe me when I say that we were based on that, the founding fathers who were abolitionists and the slave owners, the abolitionists realized in order to become a nation, they had to make a major compromise with evil. They had to compromise with the slave owning class, and we had to become a nation first. They had to put the moral issue of slavery on hold in order to become a nation, because they could not have become a nation if they had stood their ground and said no slavery, because half the colonies would not have fought on the side of the patriots. Okay, you would not have had George Washington as the commander-in-chief of the patriots. So they had to make a compromise. They had to put the moral issue of slavery on the back burner. And in 1776, all 13 colonies had slavery, northern and southern alike. It wasn't until 1780 that the beginnings of 5 different colonies in the north, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, began the process of gradual emancipation. It started in 1780 and ended in 1784 for those 5 colonies. Washington used black troops in the American Revolution. Now, in the beginning, he was reluctant to do that because he didn't feel like black troops would make good soldiers, and he didn't consider them equal to the white man. But out of necessity, he started using black troops. And it has been estimated at least a third of our army was black during the American Revolution. And the Declaration of Independence, there was language deleted from the Declaration of Independence that was written by Jefferson. The reason it was deleted, there were the people on the committee to adapt the Declaration of Independence were John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and there was one other, I can't remember his name, but this is the words that Jefferson wanted to write in the original Declaration of Independence, and the ones who struck it from the Declaration of Independence were the abolitionists. The reason they did it was because they were afraid that it would offend the southern slave owners and cause them to break away. But this is what Jefferson's original language was in the Declaration of Independence. He said he was talking to the King of England. He said, "He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people," talking about the slave, "who never offended him, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold." That was stricken from the Declaration of Independence. It was written by Thomas Jefferson. Under the Articles of Confederation that came later, after toward the end of the American Revolution, which became our government before the Constitution, the Northwest Ordinance prohibited slavery in the new Northwest Territories. Those states that would eventually come out of the Northwest Territory were Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. So slavery was banned by the original Congress from that territory. Also, another thing that shows hope, you're getting a mixed bag from the Founding Fathers. They were looking toward the future. They said once they adapted the Constitution that was written in 1787, Constitution banned slave trade 20 years from the ratification of the Constitution. That happened, and 20 years from the ratification was in 1808. In 1808, the United States banned the slave trade. Okay? This was the South and the North. Okay, another thing that was passed in the original Constitution in 1787 was the 3/5 rule. The 3/5 rule has been claimed by many people on the civil rights side that it was derogatory because it was saying that a slave only amounted to 3/5 of a person. But what they're not looking at, that was actually an anti-slavery measure. The reason they said 3/5 was that slaves equal 3/5 of a person as far as congressional representation was that they did not want the South to have too much political power. They were trying to limit their power in Congress. If they had ruled that the blacks were a complete human being, then the South would have had even more power in Congress. So actually, that was an anti-slavery measure. Also, in Congress in 1790, Benjamin Franklin, who was frail and old and on his near death, he tried to end slavery in Congress. He proposed a bill that was debated to end slavery. The problem was in 1790, the United States was just not far along enough yet. Benjamin Franklin got some support on that, but they just weren't far enough along to end slavery in 1790. But the attempt was made. Okay, now I want to go back and prove to you, well, at least it's great evidence to prove, that America was founded on the concept that all men are created equal, and the very people that proved this point was the Confederacy itself. In 1861, Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy, he gave a speech in Savannah, Georgia on March 21st, 1861. He writes, "The prevailing ideas entertained by him," talking about Thomas Jefferson and most of the leading statesmen at the time, of the formation of the old Constitution, meaning our Constitution we have today, were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. It was an evil they knew not well how to deal with. But the general opinion of the men of that day was that somehow or other, in the order of providence, the institution would be evanescent and pass away. See, he's confirming there that the Founding Fathers believed this. They believed that one day slavery would pass away. They believed at the time that they wrote the Constitution that slavery was a dying institution. Okay? This idea, though, not incorporated in the Constitution, was the prevailing idea of that time. The Constitution, it is true, secured every essential guarantee to the institution while it should last, and hence no argument can justly urge against the constitutional guarantees thus secured because of the common sentiment of that day. Those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of the races. This was an error. It was a sandy foundation, and the government built upon it fell when the storm came and the wind blew. Our government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is a natural and normal condition. This is our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. Alexander Stevens was a Democrat, a staunch Democrat, and he's arguing with the founding fathers. He's saying to them, you said all men are created equal. I take issue with that. I'm saying that the black man is not equal to the white man and has not a stake in the Declaration of Independence, or is not true that all men are created equal. This proves beyond a shadow of a doubt to me that anyone that tries to say that the Confederacy was that the war was fought on states' rights issue it was not. It was fought based on the moral sin of slavery, and more specifically, the expansion of slavery. So I want to go back to the beginning. Now we come to the early foundations of the Democratic Party, and let's go back to the cotton gin. Okay, here the founding fathers were believing that slavery was on its way out, and it was. Something changed that around. Cotton gin was invented in 1793 by Eli Whitney. Some people say that it wasn't Eli Whitney that invented that cotton gin. Some people believe it was a black slave that invented it. But I don't know if we can prove that. Thomas Jefferson. Okay, and now one thing you got to understand, that, well, I don't want to get ahead of myself. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory from France. Okay, he got a good deal on it. I forgot how much he paid for it, but that was a lot of territory. He went from Louisiana all the way out to the northwest states of Washington and Oregon today. It was a huge amount of territory, and it was a territory that America could expand into, and the southern part of that territory was land that the southern planters wanted to expand slavery into. Okay? Now, what I want to lay out right here is how slavery it went from bad to worse. Okay? Prior to 1820, the major cash crops in slavery were tobacco, rice, indigo, sugarcane, but tobacco was the major cash crop. And tobacco was hard on the land. It was wearing the land out. Well, you got to look at the timeline here. In 1813, Andrew Jackson, who was a slave owner and the founder of the modern Democratic Party, defeated the Creek Indians at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. By doing that, he secured the deep South states of Alabama and Mississippi for the planter class. Okay, this would eventually, cotton growing would eventually expand into those states. Then he came along in the War of 1812 on January the 8th, 1815, and one of the most astounding defeats in military history. He defeated the best troops that the British had at the Battle of New Orleans. He did that with a combination of Tennessee militia, pirates, free blacks, just a kind of a mongrel group, okay, that defeated the best army in the world in New Orleans. But what we have to look at is that the British were coming to take back the Louisiana Purchase. They were coming to take all that land back, Well, what Jackson did by defeating the British was secure all that land for the United States. So then Jackson comes along in 1819, and he invades Florida. He did this not only to gain more slave territory or cotton growing territory for the United States, but to rob the slaves of a sanctuary to escape. They were escaping from the lower South into Florida and living among the Creek tribe. The Seminole tribes. And so he wanted to destroy that sanctuary for slaves to escape to. He also wanted to help keep Spain from allying itself and instigating Indian raids into American territory from Florida. So in 1820, I think it was, we bought Florida from the Spanish. They realized that they did not have the military power to fight off the United States so far away from home, so they sold Florida to the United States. So this is more southern territory that the planter class was able to get.
Not to get you off track, but
jump in any time.
Yeah, I was going to say, just to avoid confusion for anybody who doesn't know, why was the cotton gin important for the cotton industry?
Because prior to the cotton gin, cotton production was not economical. As we expanded our territory, and Jackson has a lot to do with that early on, is by conquering all this land. He expanded the empire, the southern, the deep state cotton empire, because once the border states, you take Tennessee, Virginia, Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland, these were considered border states, okay? You take a slave like Frederick Douglass, okay? Look how close he was to freedom, okay? He managed to get into the northern states, okay, and get free. If Frederick Douglass had been sold downriver to Montgomery, Alabama, or Atlanta, Georgia, or Jackson, Mississippi, even Harriet Tubman, she lived on the border states. It was easier for a black person. They had a chance of escape. Well, I'm not saying even in the Deep South they had some chance of escape, but it was a lot easier escaping from Tennessee, Kentucky, Maryland. But anyway, but you see my point, is that slavery got ugly because a lot of times, too, in the border states, the slaves were, let's say you were an old established family in Virginia or Kentucky or Tennessee, and, most southern planters were land poor anyway, okay? They didn't have a lot of cash on hand, but they had a lot tied up in assets, okay? So let's say the old man planter guy, he's, planter master, getting old, and he's getting ready to die, and he's afraid that his family's going to go hungry. So what does he do? He sells off some of his slaves, and more than likely they're going downriver, it got to the point where many slaves were more afraid of going downriver than they were getting lashed, It was such a, it was like almost the condemnation, or a death sentence, to get sent back down there. But anyway, so I hope you understand that the United States is expanding. This land is expanding. Cotton plant production areas are growing. Okay, and then so by 1820, you had all this land in place. Okay, so so the South's wanting Missouri to enter the Union. That Missouri is a territory. The North said, if we let y'all have Missouri, that's going to mean y'all going to have more representative in Congress than we do. So they come up with a compromise that we call the Missouri Compromise. And Maine came into the Union. Maine comes in the Union. They said, okay, we'll get Maine, you get Missouri. Okay, that balances everything out as far as representation. But I can't remember. Do you remember the parallel that they set for the Missouri Compromise? But it was a parallel they set, I think, on the northern border of Missouri. I can't remember exactly. But anything above that line was like any territory out there. If they became a state, then it would be a free state above that line. Anything below that line would be a slave state. Okay.
It was just the river, wasn't it?
I can't remember. I don't know everything, but
Oh.
No, I mean, really, I don't know that's something I need to look at exactly where that parallel was, but anyway, so the Missouri Compromise was when tensions were rising between the southern states and the North. They come up with this compromise. You'll see a pattern develop where compromises were made between North and South to keep us from going to war. They were just delaying the inevitable. Okay. So after the Missouri Compromise, the Democratic Party they often trace its origins to the inspiration of the Democratic Republican Party, founded by Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and other influential opponents of the Federalists in 1792. Organizationally, the modern Democratic Party arose in the 1830s with the election of Andrew Jackson. Jackson made the party of slavery. Okay, another thing the Democratic Party did that was disruptive, in my opinion, was the Indian Removal Act that was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson on May 28, 1830. It authorized the president to grant unsettled lands west of Mississippi in exchange for Indian lands within existing state borders. A few tribes went peacefully, but many resisted the relocation policy. This was a terrible thing because the Indians, one of the things that the white man always wanted the Indian to do was become white. They wanted them to act white. They wanted them to dress white. They wanted to take on the white culture. Okay, these so-called five civilized tribes: the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek. I can't remember all of them exactly, but they all became more westernized. The Cherokee, probably more so than anybody. They were dressing. They were like white men, farming. They were losing their heritage, but anyway, they found gold in the hills of Georgia where the Cherokee, most of the tribe was living, and that's one of the reasons they moved them out, because of that gold in northern Georgia. Now, there's still a pocket of Cherokee in western Carolina, but they were the holdouts, But pretty much everybody else was pushed off their land. And so this is what Jackson and the Democratic Party did to the Indian. Okay, there was also another tactic that was developed by the Democratic Party during this time. It was called the dough faces. Now, the reason I call them dough faces was it's a northern congressman not opposed to slavery in the South before or during the American Civil War. He's a northerner sympathetic to the South during the same period. Presidents Martin Van Buren, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan were dough faces. The reason they call them dough faces is because dough is soft and pliable. They could mold them into whatever they wanted. But these three presidents were northerners who were strongly pro-Southern. And this was a strategy developed by Martin Van Buren. He wanted to keep Southern interest, always to the forefront, so we could avoid civil war and avoid disunion. But I think it just led more to eventual civil war. Now, the next thing that the Democratic Party did was the Mexican-American War. It followed in the wake of the 1845 U.S. annexation of Texas, which Mexico still considered Mexican territory, since the government did not recognize the treaty signed by Mexican General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna when he was prisoner of the Texan Army during the 1836 Texas Revolution. The Republic of Texas was a de facto independent country, but most of its people wanted to be annexed by the United States. And so Mexico, although they lost Texas fair and square in the Texas Revolution of 1836 at San Jacinto, they never really accepted that. And the boundary of Texas at that time agreed to both sides. I don't know how to pronounce this river, but it was Nueces. I believe it's Nuences River in Texas. And now if you look at that river, it shortens the territory of Texas quite a bit. Okay, but what the Texans wanted and the Americans wanted was the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande would give them a lot more land, and so what they did was, which to me was wrong, they claimed that land and they called it a boundary dispute, and they went down. There was Mexican troops in that area between the Rio Grande and the Nueces River. I can't pronounce it, but anyway, the Americans attacked the Mexican forces there, and this is what started the Mexican-American War. Mexicans were probably rightly on their own territory. The Americans were on territory they claimed for themselves. Okay, now this war lasted from 1846 to 1848, and this is what General Ulysses S. Grant said about this war. This is how he felt about it. He said, "Generally, the officers of the Army were indifferent whether the annexation was consummated or not, but not so all of them. For myself, I was bitterly opposed to the measure, and to this day regard the war, which resulted as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. It was an instance of a republic following the bad example of European monarchies and not considering justice and their desire to acquire additional territory." Now, this set off a firestorm, okay, because what happened was, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, we gained all this land. We secured Texas. We gained the new territories that would become the states of Nevada, New Mexico, California, and a lot of the Southwest. Okay, eventually Polk was the Democratic president at that time during the Mexican-American War. He would eventually, through treaty process, gain what it was called the Oregon Territory, which would become the states of Oregon and Washington. So basically, this is when the United States became sea to shining sea. Okay, but you got to look at what the Southerners were looking at and how this caused so much. This led us to Civil War because, by 1850 there was a big argument over what we were going to do with this territory out west. The Southerners wanted to create states below the Missouri Compromise line that would become slave states. The Northerners didn't want that to happen. So in order to avoid war, we came up with the Compromise of 1850. It was a set of laws passed in the midst of fierce wrangling between groups favoring slavery and groups opposing it. It attempted to give something to both sides. The compromise admitted California, the United States, as a free, no-slavery state, but allowed some newly acquired territories to decide on slavery for themselves. Part of the compromise included the Fugitive Slave Act, which has proved highly unpopular in the North. Senator Henry Clay was a force behind the passage of the compromise. Now, think about that for a moment. We already had a Fugitive Slave Act in the Constitution or law, but this enforced that law. It put people like Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, people who are strongly in the North that were strongly opposed to slavery. It almost made them felons or outlaws, because if they didn't turn in an escaped slave, then they could be charged with a crime. So slave catchers were sent into the North to track down fugitive slaves. This was highly unpopular in many of the northern states, especially in the New England states. So you can see the friction building here toward a civil war. Okay, in 1854, Congress, Kansas was trying to become a state. Missouri wanted to send its slave owners into Kansas, form their own constitution, and make Kansas a slave state.
The Northerners had the same idea.
Huh?
The Northerners had the same idea.
Well, yeah, they went in there too to oppose, Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons the Northerners went in there, see, this is kind of breaks up a myth about abolitionism. Abolitionism was not all based on the idea of that it was not based on racial equality. Okay, it was based on the idea they didn't want to compete with black labor. That was one of the driving forces in Kansas. Okay, and now there were some.
Yeah, like John Brown.
Yeah, John Brown, who was an egalitarian abolitionist.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I guess he's more of an egalitarian.
Yeah, he was the kind of guy that wanted social, civil rights for all black people, including freedom, okay? You had people like Thaddeus Stevens in the North that was egalitarian, but we'll get to them later. But anyway, in Kansas, it became known as Bleeding Kansas because you had basically a civil war started in Kansas before our own civil war started. John Brown hacked 6 pro-slavery people to death with broadswords at Pottawatomie Creek, before the outbreak of our Civil War. Okay, then there was the founding of the Republican Party. That was in 1854 in Wisconsin. And these were people made up of people opposed to slavery, ex-Whigs, Lincoln had been a Whig, and ex-Free Soilers, ex-anti-slavery Democrats. The name was partly chosen to pay homage to Thomas Jefferson's Republican Party. The first official party convention was held on July the 6th, 1854 in Jackson, Michigan. So the Dred Scott decision was was probably the catalyst that got Abraham Lincoln active in politics. It was to fight the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Okay, it really riled up people because what the Kansas-Nebraska Act did was it nullified the Missouri Compromise. Because what it was saying was that an individual state could vote and decide whether they wanted to be free or slave. Okay, it didn't matter where they were at. Okay. So in 1857, Judge Roger Taney on the Supreme Court tried to put an end to the slavery issue once and for all by issuing a landmark Supreme Court case, one of the worst ever made, by the Supreme Court, the Dred Scott decision. This was where a former slave had went with his master, who was in the military, up in the free states, and so he was suing for his freedom because he had been taken in the free states, and he felt like that he should be free. This, I think, was done as a kind of a test case, kind of the way they did with what's her name, Rosa Parks. Try to test the Supreme Court to try to bring a decision favorable to their cause. But it did not come out in his favor. It basically, Taney ruled that black people were not covered by the Constitution. They had no citizenship rights, which I believe was totally wrong. He basically said that a black man had no rights that a white man was bound to honor. Out of those 9 justices, 7 were Democrats that voted for it, 2 were Republicans that voted against it. So we get to the Civil War. Now the Dred Scott decision is leading us up to Civil War, and then, of course, you had the book Uncle Tom's Cabin came out. Close to the Civil War, you had the Uncle Tom's Cabin. That was Harriet Beecher Stowe, right? Uncle Tom's Cabin.
I believe so.
Well, anyway, all this kind of led to that, created the tensions for the Civil War. The original 13th Amendment, a lot of people don't know this, was a last-minute attempt to avoid the Civil War. And what it proposed was, instead of freeing the slaves, the original 13th Amendment wanted to make slavery perpetual in the United States. So we get to the Democratic Party of 1860 and the election of 1860. You had a bunch of people called the Fire Eaters, that some of the more famous Fire Eaters were William Barksdale and Maxie Gregg, and you had John J. Pettus. You had some of the more famous William Lowndes Yancey and Louis Wigfall. And one name that kind of stands out here is Edmund Pettus. I don't know if you remember seeing the pictures of the marchers being beaten with nightsticks crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama in 1965. But that's where that name comes from. But anyway, the Democrats, led by these Fire Eaters, they were determined to split the Democratic Party because they knew that if the Democratic Party was united in 1860, they would win the election. They wanted to ensure that Abraham Lincoln would win the election because they were wanting to go to war, and they used the excuse that if Abraham Lincoln won, they would go to war. And they laid the gauntlet down. They said, basically, if Abraham Lincoln wins this election, and all Abraham Lincoln was saying was, I'm against slavery. I think it's immoral, but I do not have the constitutional authority to end slavery. So, I'm not going to touch slavery where it already exists. I just don't want it spreading into the territories. That's all that Abraham Lincoln was saying. Then what happened, the Northern and Southern Democratic Party split in two, and John C. Breckinridge became the leading candidate of the Southern Democratic Party. He was the pro-slavery candidate. Then you had Stephen A. Douglas, who was the Northern Democratic politician or presidential candidate, and you had Lincoln, and then you had one guy that was from Nashville. His name was John Bell, and he was running on the Constitutional Union Party, which was a compromise party between
the
North
Union
and
as
South.
it is.
Huh?
What was it? The Union as it is
Right.
Kind of what was their
He wanted the status quo, basically. Yeah. You know, but well, let me explain something about what was going on in the North at that time, and I want to talk about the divisions of the Republican Party. You had several different kinds of abolitionists, okay? Actually, you had what they called anti-slavery men. This made up the vast majority of politicians in the North in the Republican Party. They hated slavery, like Lincoln, but their main goal was preserving the Union. That's what they were about. They did not want to allow the Union to be destroyed, but they were willing to allow slavery to exist in the southern states where it already existed. They were not about, they just didn't want to spread slavery. Then you had a smaller group that was called the abolitionists, okay? They hated slavery, and they were even willing to destroy the Union in order to abolish slavery. William Lord Garrison called the Constitution an agreement with hell and a covenant with death. They made these guys made up a minority of the Republicans, but they were viewed with contempt by most Republicans. They were looked at as agitators and troublemakers. But as abolitionists, as I said a while ago, they were not all egalitarian. They were not all, just because you were an abolitionist and wanted to destroy slavery, basically what the abolitionists wanted to do, they didn't want a gradualism. They wanted it ended now, okay? Just because you're an abolitionist didn't mean that you wanted to sit down and eat supper with the black man. You didn't necessarily want social and civil equality with the black man. You just wanted him free, and you wanted him free now, okay? But here's where even smaller group, they were a tiny group in the Republican Party. They were called the egalitarians. They were people like Thaddeus Stevens who wanted full civil and social equality like we have today, basically, with black people. I mean, Thaddeus Stevens even had a common law wife. You know, of course, he couldn't marry her back then. But he had his black maid was his wife, okay? And they lived together for years, okay? So he was all in for social, civil equality and the abolition of slavery. Okay. During the Civil War, you had another disruptive element of the Democratic Party that you see coming back time and time again during Vietnam, during Iraq, during Afghanistan, after 9/11, is the Copperheads. This was a political faction that they were also known as the Peace Democrats. They were a faction of the Democrats in the Union who opposed the American Civil War, wanted immediate peace settlement with the Confederates. Republicans started calling anti-war Democrats Copperheads, framing them as a poisonous and venomous snake, which, you know, look at Vietnam. They did this again in Vietnam. They did it in Iraq. They did it in Afghanistan. This strain of Democrats have always existed in the Democratic Party during times of war, and they've been a divisive factor. They were also racist. Matter of fact, the Copperheads were behind the New York City draft riots of 1863, where Irish Americans and these people, these Copperhead and sentiment that were against the war, they rioted because of the Draft Act. Okay, and they hung black people from the lamppost in New York City. Okay. This was in the summer of 1863.
Sounds pretty peaceful.
It was right after the Battle of Gettysburg, and Lincoln had to send troops that had just fought at Gettysburg into New York City to quell this riot. Okay. So here we come, the election of 1864. The Copperhead plank was the plank of the Democratic Party. They wanted a negotiated peace with the South. They wanted to bring an end to the war after all the dying and bloodshed and everything. And they were willing even to let the South go its way and North go its way. And so what happened was McClellan, who was a war Democrat, who had led the armies early in the war. He was a horrible general, but he was very popular with his men. He ran as the head of the ticket for the peace platform of 1864, but McClellan, he had a little different idea. He wasn't for necessarily negotiating or letting the South go its own way. He wanted to win the war, they think actually one of the reasons that McClellan did not try to end the war when he had the chance when he was general was because he wanted a negotiated peace with the South. I mean, this has been thrown around.
Well, that was what he was running on when he was opposing Lincoln.
Yeah. He wanted a negotiated peace.
Let's just call this thing quits.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And keep slavery intact. Okay.
So you think he wanted to do that when he was still a general under Lincoln, right?
Well, I've heard that's a possibility. I've heard that there was a possibility of McClellan being a Democrat and in opposition to Lincoln. You talk about the way Trump.
Well, I mean, when he was still a general.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Oh, okay.
They believe that he was allowing politics to determine.
Oh, okay.
How he planned strategy, how he pressed the war against. This may or may not be true, but McClellan was a horrible general. I mean, he was overly
fired.
Yeah, overly cautious. But anyway, then comes along the thing that changed everything was that William Tecumseh Sherman, as late as August of 1864, things were going better than the public realized, but it looked like the armies were in a stalemate. Lee was surrounded at Petersburg, but he was holding on. The casualties were mounting. Sherman was not able to capture Atlanta. And so as late as August of 1864, Lincoln wrote a note to his cabinet saying that he was going to be defeated in the coming election, possibly. And but the thing that turned everything around is Sherman captured Atlanta. I think it was on September 2nd or 3rd. I can't remember the exact date, but
Sherman's march.
Well, he captured Atlanta. He had to capture them first.
Yeah.
And what happened was this turned everything around because it gave the North hope that the war was finally coming to an end, that, they could see the light at the end of the tunnel. And that was Lincoln's salvation. Okay. Now, at the end of the war, the absolutely worst thing, and this is something I could talk on all day. It's kind of ironic. I don't believe in coincidences, really. But two of the worst presidents to come along at a critical point in our history, and they came after an assassination, was Andrew Johnson and Lyndon Johnson. Okay? Andrew Johnson, Abraham Lincoln, I believe, had the only chance of anybody of pulling off a successful Reconstruction. But when he got shot that night at Ford's Theater, Andrew Johnson became president. Andrew Johnson was a compromise. This is where I hate bipartisanship to a point, because it was a bipartisan move to put Andrew Johnson on the ticket because he's a war Democrat. Okay, so you had they changed the name of the Republican Party at that point from the Republican Party to the National, Union Party.
National, yeah.
And so what happened was Andrew Johnson, after Lincoln, I think Lincoln wanted to include the black man in reconciliation of the two halves of the country. He wanted to include them.
Yeah, but by this point, his whole angle had changed. Is the war at this point?
Well, by this time, they were able to free the slaves with the 13th Amendment.
Yeah,
And
obviously,
but see, all the Emancipation Proclamation was a war measure. It was what do you call it, executive order.
Yeah.
And it could be rescinded by any future president. So that's why he pushed the 13th Amendment to free the slaves. So nobody could do that. Okay. Well, what happened when Lincoln got shot? Johnson came in there, and Johnson wanted to do the same thing that Lincoln did. He wanted to let them up easy, talking about the good South. But he wanted the reconciliation not to include the black man. He wanted to include the white Southerner and the white Northerner, okay? And what happened was that in the late 1860s, you had the Klan start in Tennessee. It was started by Forrest to keep the black people and the white Republicans who were trying to spread Republican Party in the South away from the polls, intimidation, basically the same tactics that Antifa's using today, okay, to intimidate. Look what they've done to us right now. They've silenced us. We're not speaking up. We're not doing anything to put a stop to this foolishness because we're scared. Nobody puts a Trump sign in their yard. Nobody puts a Trump, wears a Trump hat. I mean, a few people do, like, idiots like me that don't worry about it. But, that what it is, it's intimidation. All this is designed. What Antifa's doing, what Black Lives Matter doing, is the same tactics that the Klan used at that time. Okay, now I always wondered one thing that happened. You had a governor in Tennessee by the name of Brownlow. Okay, and he was a staunch anti-union man. He hated the South, and so what he did, he organized militia to chase fight the Klan and chase them down and all that. He show you what he did when the 14th Amendment was passed in Tennessee. He all the people that didn't want the 14th Amendment, they decided not to show up in Congress, and so he couldn't get a quorum. So I think he needed 2 men to get a quorum. So we went out and had these men arrested and drug into the Capitol building just so they could have a quorum, but he didn't allow them to vote. They just had to be present on Capitol Hill so they could legally vote the 14th Amendment in, okay? So that's how he got the 14th Amendment. That's the kind of tactics he was using. But what he did, I mean, he was effective to a point against the Klan. But what happened was, in the late 1800s, he realized, he saw the writing on the wall, especially in Tennessee, that they were losing the Reconstruction battle. For a few years, blacks had a degree of freedom in the South, and it was enforced by the bayonet. Because in 1867, I believe it was, the North passed, Northern Congress, the Republicans passed the law in instituting military districts. You had 5 military districts in the South. So that by the point of the bayonet, they were protecting Southern blacks, and so the blacks were being elected to Congress in Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, all over the South. But that was only because they were being protected, okay? But as you got on, especially into the 1870s and everything, you saw cracks starting to form. People in the North were getting tired of always at odds and fighting with people in the South. They were tired of the war. They'd lost 750,000 men in the war. They just wanted to get it behind them. And so you start seeing this war weariness take over. And I always wondered why Nathan Bedford Forrest disbanded the Klan in 1868. I always heard it was because he was tired of the violence and, the people that try to, clean Forrest up, that he wasn't actually part of the Klan, blah, blah, blah. But actually, I finally figured it out. The reason that Forrest disbanded the Klan is because Brownlow had seen the writing on the wall. He ran for Senate. He got out of Dodge, and a compromise governor came into the state of Tennessee. And the reason that Forrest shut the Klan down is because he knew he'd won, because he knew the direction that the South was headed in, that eventually the white man would take over, the Democratic Party would take over its rightful place in the South and become the solid South that it eventually became, and that segregation would be instituted all throughout the South. Okay,
is that your theory?
Well, yeah. I mean, it makes sense to me. I mean, when I think about Forrest doing it because it was too much violence, that's out of character for Forrest, because Forrest was the epitome of violence. I think it was like a light bulb came in my head. I realized that he was seeing the direction that we were going politically, and that there was no need for the Klan at that point in Tennessee. Now, and what happened was Ulysses S. Grant in the southern states like Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana and places like that, he enacted several civil rights bills and anti-Ku Klux Klan bills that pretty much put the Klan out of business for a while, okay? But what happened was, as you get closer to Grant leaving office in 1876 or 1877, and then you have what they call the Compromise of 1877. That was when Rutherford B. Hayes was running against Samuel Tilden. It was one of the closest elections in American history. Rutherford B. Hayes did not win the electoral vote. Tilden had the most votes, but he didn't have enough to go over the top. So what happened was there were 3 southern states plus 1 delegate in Oregon. I think it was 3 or maybe 4. But anyway, they threw their electoral votes behind. They had a backroom deal with Rutherford B. Hayes. We will make you president if you will end Reconstruction. You will remove the troops out of the South. And so what they did, now this is a dark blot on the Republican Party. This is where they made that deal for political reasons to get elected. They beat out Samuel Tilden, who had the most popular votes, had the most electoral votes until that deal was made. Okay, and so what happened was, after 1877, the white man, the Democratic Party, became the ruling party in the South. And see, another thing that happened was all these ex-planters that had been disloyal to the Union. Now, Johnson was, at first, he was giving all these ex-Confederate soldiers, just a regular common man that fought in the field, he was giving their citizenship back pretty quick. But he was making the Southern planters come to him begging for their citizenship back. Okay, now this is the way I look at it. I think we'd have had a better Reconstruction if Sherman's Special Orders number 15, Field Orders number 15, had went into effect, and all that land that those Southern planters, like on the coast and everything, had given up, had left their land, and all that land was available. If they wanted to give these ex-slaves 40 acres, okay, and that's where the term 40 acres and a mule comes from, and they would have worked it, and then it's squatted on it, and then at some point had the right to buy it. Okay, I think that was fair, considering that these disloyal planters, that would have been the consequences of going to war and losing a war. Losing your land. Okay, and it would have given the black people a feeling of ownership. But what happened was Johnson, he at first he hated the planter class. It was a class thing with him more so than a race thing. He hated the planters, and it was a class thing because he came up a rough, he was a common man, poorly educated, all that, and he was looked down upon by the planters, and so, but what he got to thinking was, okay, at first he was making them crawl on their hands and knees to him to become American citizens again. Then he got to thinking, well, wait a minute. If I give them their land back, let them become American citizens, then we can ensure that the blacks will not have a say in Southern politics. Okay, so that's what he did. He did all this before the Congress came back in session. This was in 1865, early 1866. And so by the time the Congress came back, he had done a lot of damage. His white supremacist policies had done a lot of damage to this country. And so from then on, the Republican Party was playing catch up by passing all these, they ended up, because of the black codes, they had to pass the 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment to the Constitution, give them more civil rights. And so what happened, though, over time, there were more people in the North that were just getting tired of all this. They were tired of the turmoil and everything. They wanted it to end, and they wanted to move toward reconciliation. But what reconciliation meant to the Southerner was taking back control of the Southern society and blocking a black man from having any power. What you got to realize is a black man, in many of these counties, like in Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi, some of those counties, you had 75% black, okay? Now, guess what? If they get to vote, guess what? You're going to have mayors black. You're going to have sheriffs going to be black. City council is going to be black, on and on and on in some of these counties in the South. And they were terrified because look how they treated black people all these years. And they were thinking, if they get power back, they're going to come after us, So part of it was based on fear. Part of it was based on prejudice, bigotry. But anyway, that's how everything got screwed up. And then by 1877, the American people, kind of like the way we were in Vietnam, the American people were tired of that war. When the Democrats sold us out in Vietnam by cutting off all the military foreign aid to the Vietnamese, nobody raised a fuss because they were ready to get out of Vietnam totally, and that's kind of what happened in that situation. But okay, y'all got any questions? Okay, so what happened? A lot of race baiters, you see the same kind of trend you see today among people in the South that, like Pitchfork Ben Tillman, Theodore Bilbo, Cotton Ed Smith. Cotton Ed Smith was, I think, a South Carolina politician that they called him Cotton because he when the cotton crop was good, he took credit for it. When the cotton crop was bad, he race baited. He blamed the black people, and that rallied the common bigoted white person. It played on their fears and all that to get them to the polls to vote for Cotton Ed Smith. And one thing you got to look at too. The North won the Civil War on the battlefield, but they lost the Second Civil War. They lost the peace, after the Civil War. The South won that peace. And as a result, they even wrote the history. They wrote the history of the Civil War that's adopted even among many Northern historians. It's called the Lost Cause myth, that that the Civil War was not about slavery, not about expansion of slavery. It was about states' rights. That was the myth that was spread in the history books, Southern historians, And that's when you started seeing the Confederate statues being built in the late 1800s, early 1900s, all across the land.
Yeah, a lot of the history books are, I believe the Daughters of the Confederacy had something to do with.
Yeah, the lady, her name was Goodlet, and she's buried out here at Mount Olivet Cemetery. She's a founder of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. It was founded in Nashville, you know.
This is the South trying to have the same economic progress as the North?
Well, no, go ahead.
Oh, well, what I was going to say is what we were getting at is basically the South was writing the history. So whenever, we're sitting back on it now, looking back at, we're still having this discussion today about what the Civil War was about because what he's saying is the North lost the battle when it came to peace. So basically they lost their commander-in-chief. And, he seems to think that Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction was near perfect.
I'm not saying it was near perfect, but it was a better plan. Because he wanted to include the black man. The reason he died was the last speech he made on the balcony of the White House. And John Wilkes Booth was standing in the yard. John Wilkes Booth was a virulent racist and a very pro-Confederate. And in that speech, he said what he wanted to do was give the vote to the very intelligent black man and the soldiers. Now, by today's standards, we would call that racist, okay? But that was very progressive, for that
the
time.
Yep.
Okay? And so, what's his name? John Wilkes Booth was standing out there, and he looked over to, I think it was Davy Harrell was standing next to him. He was one of the conspirators. And I'm quoting him, and I'm not saying this using the N-word. I'm quoting John Wilkes Booth. He said, that means in voting, okay? He's a dead man, basically, something to that effect, okay? And about 3 days later, Lincoln was dead. Well, let's see, this was about the 11th of April, and I think he was shot on the 14th.
They lost their commander-in-chief. So, post-Civil War, you had a lot of Southern Democrat politicians with a lot of influence, and you had people like the Daughters of the Confederacy, but they went up to schools and said, hey, if you're teaching on the Civil War, you're going to use these books, and we're going to make heroes out of people like Nathan Bedford Forrest. And that's where you see a lot of these statues come up.
Yeah, I mean, it was...
Well, I want to break it down back to, I think, economic issues versus the black issue.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean
that's kind of what they were trying to paint, right?
What they were wanting to do, see, the South had it ranked as one of the 5 top economies in the world before the Civil War.
Based on cotton?
Based on cotton, based on slaves, based on slave equipment.
But it was all lopsided.
It actually had more money, it had more invested in slavery than the North had in industry.
But the practical industries of the North were missing from the South.
Right. Well, not totally. Nashville had a good industrial base. Richmond had a pretty good industrial base. Certain cities, Selma, Alabama, certain cities, but not in the same vein as the North. Plus, our railroad system wasn't as advanced as the North.
But your problem was they were getting all their money from exporting the goods. So,
and then we were a consuming nation. Okay, because we didn't have that much industry, but see what you had going on in the South when they went back to their plantations, the Southern planters, they didn't have slaves anymore, but they had to have somebody pick that cotton, pick the crops, and do the work. So what they tried to do was to force the freedmen back on the plantations to work. Okay. Freeman said, screw you, we're not doing this, okay? Or at least most of them did. Some went back. But so what the South started doing after Andrew Johnson emboldened them. See, one thing about Andrew Johnson if he had come out right after the end of the Civil War, and I'm not saying he necessarily had to hang anybody or anything like that, but the ex-Southern soldiers and generals and everything, they were kind of waiting in the shadows, waiting to see what the North was going to do. They were at their mercy, okay? And so what Johnson did by coming back so easy on them and sending this message to them that he wanted the white man back in charge, not the black man, it emboldened these ex-Confederates. You know, they wanted to take their seats back. They boldly went to Washington. They had a fight between the Republicans and the Confederates that were coming to reclaim their seats. The Republicans wouldn't even allow them to reclaim their seats. Okay, and you can't blame them because we just fought a Civil War, and here all of a sudden you're showing up,
giving everything back.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so what happened was by emboldening them, same way that we're doing these rioters out here, they started pushing more and more, and they started to see that, hey, what we can do, we can start doing things. Okay, we don't have slavery anymore, but we'll pass black codes. We'll say, if you don't work on the plantations, we'll get you for vagrancy.
Meaning statewide or local.
Or statewide, local, wherever,
Yeah,
okay?
yeah.
And so what they were doing, they come up with a system called convict leasing. It was through private sources, mines, private industry, cotton plantation, wherever. If a black person spit on the sidewalk, he could be arrested and put into. It was like the forerunner of a chain gang. Okay, but the only difference was a chain gang, which came later, in around the late 1800s, early 1900s, after the convict leasing system passed away, was a chain gang. You could only work on public projects. The convict leasing system was where the state would lease these prisoners to, say, Plantation X. Okay. And
almost back to
and
square
that would
one.
make a private contract between the state, and they were making money off of it. Okay, this is how they re-enslaved their former slaves. Okay,
So by doing that didn't boost the cotton industry back up to some
well,
degree?
it did somewhat. I mean,
But
see,
not to where they
you
were.
had two things going on. You had the fact that the South was in bad shape after the Civil War. I mean, there was Middle Tennessee and all this area had been one of the most fertile areas, and it was virtually destroyed in the war by all the trampling armies and foraging and all that stuff. So the South would, even if they had a perfect system after the Civil War, they would have had a struggle because it took them about 50 years just to recover from the Civil War.
But the demand was there for the cotton, though.
It was there, but
if they were exporting hot and heavy, then people were still waiting.
Yeah,
for
but
that.
see, the same small minority of plantation owners were still controlling. They call them the bourbon class. Okay, but then you had, as we went toward the late 1800s, you had the rise of what they call the redneck class. Okay, now rednecks doesn't necessarily mean a pejorative. It's just a class of people, the working people and that type of thing. But anyway, many of these so-called rednecks had been part of the overseer class, the one that kept the blacks, and this is where Pitchfork Ben Tillman, that was his class, of white politician, that came to power in the late 1800s. But you had a class system, but these people were using the tactics that they're using the modern Democratic Party to hold people down. They had to convince the white people, who were as poor almost as the blacks, that you might be poor, but you're better than that guy over there, talking about the black people. And then, of course, they used a pejorative. But that's how they kept them in line. They play on their fears. They play on their fears of the blacks coming to get them, because of all the past treatment. and all that, and also, it's like it's like they would do they would always the South. One of the things people didn't realize about the South, we always talk about the plight of the slave, but we never think about the plight of the white man in the South. He was poor. He was dirt poor, and he was being held down by this class of planters, okay? And on purpose, it served their purposes. It kept them maintaining power, the same way the Democrats are doing today. Look at the cities, the conditions they're in. Look at the blacks, the conditions they're in the inner cities and all that. They're democratic regimes that have been in power for years and years and years, and they're using the same tactics, when George Floyd died the other day, all of us were united, but how soon did they come in and make it a racial thing, and take us away from the real problems? The real problems are in the inner cities, the plight of people that are blowing each other away night after night. George Floyd was 18 times more likely to get killed by another black man than he was by a road police officer. But we're not talking about what the real problems were. And Martin Luther King said something that was very I like what he said one time. He said, when the black man gets his rights and gets his freedom, the white man will get his too. And that's exactly what happened in the South. After the 1964-65 Civil Rights Act, or before those acts, you didn't have no big companies like Bridgestone, Nissan, Northern companies. No big industries or anything wanted to move here because of the way our society was structured, all the racial problems we had, and the corrupt politicians and all that. But after everybody got the right to vote, and the white politicians had to answer, the needs of their black constituencies, then all these northern industries and foreign industries started eyeing the South and all our potential. Look at all the raw materials that the South has. Look at our river systems. We got tremendous cheap electricity because of TVA. We've got all kinds of natural resources. We got coal. We've got copper. We've got this. We got that. It's like Mexico. Mexico's no reason and they should be poor. They've got all kinds of resources down there. It's their corrupt government that's holding them down. Same way in the South. There was a Southern government that was holding the black man and the white man down. Okay? But you know what's funny? Things didn't change until it became an economic problem for the white man in the South. And a convict lease system. You know why we got rid of that? Because they had mines down in East Tennessee that were using convict lease labor. Okay, the white miners who were trying to make a buck in competition with that, they couldn't compete against that. So they got mad one day. I forget the name. They called it the Cold Creek Wars, I think is what they called it in East Tennessee. And they kept going over there and raiding the mines where the blacks were working, and taking them out. And they didn't kill them or anything, but they just ran them off. Okay, this happened 2 or 3 times, and finally they kept putting them back. So finally one day, the miners all marched from East Tennessee down to Nashville to the courthouse and surrounded it and demanded an end to convict labor. Okay, that ended in Tennessee. Pretty soon it spread across the South, okay? Now, that was white men getting mad about economic disadvantages that caused the end of that system, okay? Tell you another example. Okay, after that, they couldn't use convict lease anymore, so they started the chain gangs. The state was using chain gang labor, which, see, convict lease was mostly black people. Okay, the only prisons you had in the South were not for black people; they were for hardened white criminals. Okay, murderers, rapists, and all that. The rest of the black people they had, I mean, if you were a really bad black guy, you know, you might get prison, but what they did with the prisoners arrested for minor violations was put them to work on all these plantations and all that. Okay. Well, once they got rid of the convict lease, which was a private run thing between the state and private owners, then they had to put them building roads, building, you know, any kind of public project. Okay. And so what happened was there was a white man, and now the makeup of the chain gang was something like 25% white and 75% black. Okay. Like, have you ever seen Cool Hand Luke? That's not realistic because everybody in that chain gang was white. Okay. Most of them were black. Okay. Well, what happened was a white guy from up north got arrested down south, and I believe it was in Georgia, and he was worked to death. I mean, he was just really brutally treated. Well, he escaped, and he got back up north, okay? And he wrote a book. I can't remember the name of it, something about my life on the chain gang or something like that. And it really pricked the conscience of a lot of people. And that was the beginning of the end of the chain gang. But what happened was, what really ended it, he got in trouble. He somehow or another, they found out where he was after he wrote the book because he escaped. And he was extradited back to Georgia, okay, and put back on the chain gang again. But by this time, people had read the book. As a matter of fact, they made a movie about it, okay? And you had this movement to get this guy off the chain gangs down in Georgia, and they finally gave in and let him go, okay? But because of his experience, that's when the chain gangs started to go away, okay? So the point I'm making is there's racism even in advancement, progressive movements. It took the white, something that happened to the bad happened to the whites to end those systems. Okay, let's go to the modern civil rights movement. Okay, remember the 3 civil rights workers that were killed down in Philadelphia, Mississippi? The emphasis, one of the reasons that was such a big story, because 2 of the guys were white. Cheney was kind of took a back seat. Cheney was the sole black guy. Okay, if that had been 3 black guys that got killed, you probably wouldn't have had that much media. Okay, another thing was about the time of the Selma March. I can't remember if it was tied in with the Selma March. There was a couple of white preachers that got killed by the Klan. Everybody raised Cain, you know. Then you had a lady, I forget her name, Viola. Her first name was Viola, and she was writing, I think it was during the Freedom Summer or where they were trying to get people to register to vote down in Mississippi. The Klan come driving up beside her, shot her in the car, they killed her. Because she was a white woman. Of course, she was, with black guys, which is no problem, but I mean, that didn't go over well down south, okay? Well, but it was the fact that a white woman got killed that raised a lot of sand. Now, this is why, and I'm not saying that black people had to have white people to get changes, but white people had a big part to play in getting changes during the modern civil rights, period. And another thing, talking about Republicans, of course, I've kind of got off track where I was going, but I wanted to, before I say anything else, I want to talk about Woodrow Wilson. Now today, Woodrow Wilson is held up high by the progressives because of his progressive policies. You know, he wanted a League of Nations. You know, he was the 14 points and all this stuff. You know, he was for the Federal Reserve and progressive income tax and all that stuff. But this guy, when he went in office, you know, Republicans had put a lot of blacks into federal government jobs, okay? He went in there and cleared them all out, okay? And then when a friend of his wrote the book, his last name was Dixon, wrote the book The Klansman, it became a movie, okay? And it was called Birth of a Nation, very racist movie. He filmed it. I mean, he premiered it in the White House. First time a movie was ever shown in the White House. He glorified that movie, talking about how right it was, how true it was. And this was the inspiration for the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. You know, and see, prior to the old Klan, they dressed up in what looked like Halloween costumes. You know, they weren't the white robe and all that. But you had several things develop. See, what happened in 1915, a guy that owned Stone Mountain, Georgia, you heard that, down in Atlanta? It's a tourist stop, you know. It's really an impressive place to go. But he burnt a cross on the top of Stone Mountain, Georgia, which could be seen all over Atlanta, okay? And that's where cross burning came about in the Klan. Before that, they never did cross burning. That's where the white robes come from. It was the rebirth of the Klan. And the difference between the old Klan and the new Klan is taxes were the same, but the old Klan only directed their hatred toward black people. The new Klan directed their hatred toward Jews, Catholics, and blacks. Okay, and after 1915 and the 20s, that's when the Klan took off. They had a clavering in every state of the Union, and it was bigger up north than it was down south. Okay, and in 1927 you had 40,000 Klansmen did a massive march on Washington D.C. And you won't find one Confederate flag in that group. You know, they were all American flags. You know. The Confederate flag battle flag didn't really become a symbol of hate until 1948 when it was used by Strom Thurmond. But anyway, then you go on and you have, during the, you had the race baiters that kept the Southern white people stirred up, kept them poor, kept them ignorant. And so what happened was, give me an example, I think a real good example of what I'm talking about. George Wallace ran against, I can't remember his name, but he ran for governor, I think it was the late 50s, in Alabama. And the guy he ran against was a virulent racist. He used the N-word left and right, okay? And so Wallace was considered a moderate on race, at that time. So when this guy won, Wallace turned to his aide and said, "I will never be out in again," And so that's when he started his move toward being more, taking a more segregation, more racist stance. And he never lost, I don't think he ever lost another election. And you will have, and see, here's the thing, show you how Democrats do. Wallace had, his constituency was all white at that time. That's why he had to stand in front of the people of Alabama and say, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever, He was appealing to that white constituency, okay? But once the 1964-65 Civil Rights Acts were passed, that would not have been able to be passed except for the Republican Party and a few Northern Democrats, is that he had to change his attitude. He had a black constituency now. I mean, Alabama's got some counties that are very populated with black people. So he couldn't appeal to that white constituency anymore. So he puts on this little show where he goes into Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, which was the home church of Martin Luther King, and apologizes in front of everybody for his racist past. This is the same thing Robert Byrd did. Robert Byrd, senator in West Virginia, had been a recruiter for the Ku Klux Klan, and somehow his apologies rang true. You know, he's sorry for all he did to the black people. You know, Hillary Clinton called him, I think, like the father of the Constitution or something like that. You know, she had very high praise for him. There's a famous picture of them smooching. You know, that's another thing. Show you the connection between that time and today, where that connection still reigns true, is take Margaret Sanger. I mean, she said she was believed in eugenics, you know, the same thing Adolf Hitler believed in. And said some of the most racist things you ever heard about black people. And talking about they wanted to get black preachers, and they didn't want black preachers to let on to the blacks that they wanted to exterminate them, you know. And today, more blacks are aborted in New York City than are born, okay? You got, in the inner cities, you got Planned Parenthood everywhere. It's not based just on trying to limit or trying to, you know, give all people abortions.
Is that current statistics?
Yes. Yeah. More black children are aborted in New York City than are born every year. Okay.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And here, what's her name? Hillary Clinton proudly accepted the Margaret Sanger Award. Okay. And then she tried to defend Margaret Sanger and tried to compare her to Thomas Jefferson. There's no comparison, you know. Huh?
That's a yikes, man.
Yeah. And look at Bill Clinton. You know, he does the same thing. You know, one of the reasons Bill Clinton was a successful politician in Arkansas, he knew how the Southern people think, and he appealed to that. Okay, it almost got him in trouble one time. It was in 1980 when he was too far to the left for him. They voted him out, and then he cleaned his act up. He went out. He started going to church. He started carrying a Bible in public, and Hillary put on a dress and put on glasses instead of. I took her glasses off and bought contacts.
Cut the hair a little bit.
Cut the hair, took a bath, you know, all that. And so it created this. This was Saul Alinsky 101, you know, clean yourself up to appeal to the conservative moderate element, okay? And so this is how but his mentor, I'm talking about Bill Clinton, was, I'm trying to think of the guy's name, Arkansas, William Fulbright, who was a segregationist. He was mentored by Fulbright. Fulbright helped him get to England to get started on his Rhodes Scholarship, you know. So you see so many links. All that's happened to the Democratic Party is that their constituencies changed, but their power tactics still exist. The thing that divides people, you know, like I said, you know, we were all united. The United States was all united when we watched that cop kill George Floyd. But look at us now, you know.
Divide and conquer.
Divide and conquer, you know, and that's what the Southern politicians were doing. Even the Northern politicians were doing that stuff. And that's what I'm saying. If you look at the history of the Democratic Party, it has been nothing but destruction, destruction, destruction. And, you know, you can go and look at, like, John Kennedy. I think John Kennedy was one of the better Democratic presidents ever. I mean, he truly cared about civil rights. But he was a conservative. I mean, he was a patriot. I mean, he had fought and nearly gave his life in World War II for this country, and he was a Cold Warrior, and something that you don't see that much in Democratic circles. And you had, Franklin Roosevelt. It's debatable. Some people, we've had this discussion. Franklin Roosevelt, even what he did, I think, was destructive for the American people. And it put us in, it prolonged the Depression. Prior to the Depression, we had never had a Depression that lasted as long as the Depression had lasted. And you can blame Franklin Roosevelt for that, the tampering with the economy. And you'd also blame Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover started that tampering. He was a Republican.
Not to mention FDR locked up people based on their race.
Yeah, that's another thing. Them locking up people of Japanese descent, and it was unevenly administered. Hawaii had so many Japanese Americans that they didn't have enough room to lock all them up. Okay, he mainly picked on the mainland Japanese, that weren't as many as there was in Hawaii, it was horrible what happened to American Japanese descent. But I will say this, in fairness, Earl Warren, who was governor of California, who was a Republican, he was also in favor of locking them up, and he was a part of that. But at least Earl Warren came back later, when he was appointed later in his life, and said it was one of the biggest mistake, or the biggest mistake he ever made, was being involved in all that. But Earl Warren, a Republican, he made sure that the Brown versus the Board of Education ruling was unanimous, and which basically opened a path for integration in our southern schools. Now, another thing a lot of people don't realize is Eisenhower appointed judges, who was a Republican, were the ones that actually moved civil rights along in the South. The rulings, for example, Johnson, I think his name was Frank Johnson, he was a Republican judge, that is the reason that Martin Luther King, the movement in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955, he won a case in 1956 that desegregated the Montgomery bus system. Okay, that was a Republican judge that did that. You can look, all the rulings that Republicans did were very progressive. But when Kennedy got in there, Kennedy, although I think his heart was in the right place, he was trying to keep that coalition alive between the Southern segregationists and Northern Democrats. So he appointed all these judges that were segregationists, and they were an impediment to the civil rights movement. But you look at Harry Truman. Harry Truman, was another guy that I like because he was a Democrat, but he had a sense of fairness. He, like Lyndon Johnson, he used the N-word till he died, okay? But he had a sense of justice. He didn't like black people coming back from World War II and being treated the way they were down south, black soldiers. He integrated the armed forces. Now, actually, he didn't get it done. I mean, he had his heart in the right place, but actually Eisenhower was the one that actually integrated the military forces. But the point I'm trying to make here right now, I want people to see this continuum of the old Democrat South. They try to say that the Republican Party was a different party back then. Now it's changed because of Nixon's Southern strategy. But what they don't realize is, or what they don't teach, is that Nixon wasn't trying to appeal to the Deep South. He was appealing to the border states that had voted for Eisenhower. I'm talking about border Southern states. And to the Southwest, because Nixon was a very progressive man. I mean, he belonged to the NAACP, and I mean, he was always stood up for civil rights. But anyway, make a long story short, the same tactics that are going on today that are keeping us divided, that are causing black people not to progress, that blacks are being slaughtered in inner cities, they're being held down, poverty. If you look at the policies of Johnson, which I don't think that was intentional to keep them in poverty, I think he truly wanted to try to help them, but his policies caused the breakup of the black family. The two Johnsons, Andrew and Lyndon, did some of the most terrible damage to this country that could ever be put on it, and both of them were Democratic president. And Johnson his policy helped destroy the black family in America. It helped destroy the white family. I mean, welfare has done damage to all classes. And then, the war in Vietnam, his management of the war in Vietnam caused the hippie movement to come along. Hippies they were the counterculture, they were influenced. The anti-war movement, the counterculture is all influenced by the Marxists that have been in our universities since late 30s. And they spread that garbage throughout our universities. And so that's what we're dealing with today. We're dealing with the results of our colleges being permeated with communism. And that's what we're seeing out. And that's what we're seeing Antifa. We're seeing with Black Lives Matter. We're seeing these are all the stormtroopers for the modern Democratic Party. Y'all got anything to finish this up that you want to say?
Just bring up that insurrection.
Yeah, we were talking earlier, and we've talked about this before, but personally, I think Trump is making a mistake. I may be proven wrong when this is all said and done, but I think Trump is making a mistake by not enacting the 1807 Insurrection Act to put this stuff down. And I think Seattle would be a golden opportunity for him to put this in implication by going and giving the warning that you've got so much time. You're talking about the governor and the mayor of Seattle to take care of this problem, issue a warning to the protesters or rioters. I don't want to call them protesters. That, hey, give them after 48 hours, we're coming in. Now, I wouldn't give them a specific time because we don't want them to know when we're coming. But bring, if he has to federalize National Guard troops, he has to federalize U.S. Army troops, the 82nd Airborne, 101st, whatever you got to do to go back and take that part of that city back. This would send a message to all the other blue state governors that are standing by and letting this stuff go on, that if you don't take care of it, this is what's going to happen to you. There's many examples in American history where strong leadership has produced good results. Give me an example. In 1919 there was a police strike in Boston, Massachusetts, and Governor Calvin Coolidge, who was governor of Massachusetts at that time, they had a weird relationship where the governor could actually had more control over the city of Boston than the mayor did. He gave the Boston, Massachusetts Police Department, because they were public servants, he gave them a certain amount of time to go back to work. They were all going to be fired, and that's what happened. He sent in the National Guard and took over control of Boston, and most of those Boston policemen never got their job back. Okay, what this did, now that sounds like tough action, But this served as an example to Ronald Reagan. Calvin Coolidge was Ronald Reagan's hero, okay, for many reasons. But what happened was it propelled this action that Calvin Coolidge took in Boston, propelled him in the position of where he was chosen to run as vice president of Warren Harding in 1920, okay. He won that election as vice president, and Harding died while in office, and it propelled Coolidge into the presidency. One reason Reagan liked him was because not only of that action, but because he cut the marginal tax rate down to 24% in the United States. He cut spending tremendously. And what it did, it propelled the United States in one of the longest, all during the 20s. That's why they called it the Roaring 20s, is because it was a great economy. Now, he gets a lot of blame by a lot of left-wing politicians for the Depression. I don't blame him, because there were some conditions that were going on at that time. We didn't have that many safeguards in our system like we do today, and even we've got safeguards in our system. It didn't prevent us from having the collapse of 2008, where we nearly had a depression. So what happened there, And again, you can blame the progressives for a lot of things, because we've had more bad recessions and depressions since the creation of the Federal Reserve System than we've ever had in the history of the United States, so regulations and all that stuff don't always work. You've got to somewhat enforce them, But anyway, if another thing too, Reagan learned from Calvin Coolidge. This is when the air traffic controllers in 1981 went out on strike. He told them, look, you got 48 hours to get back to work. I'm firing every one of you. And they didn't believe him. 48 hours later, he fired them all and never hired them back. They never got their job back. The American people were clapping on the sideline. They backed the president. When George W. Bush went into Afghanistan after 9/11, the American people were on his side. When he went into Iraq in 2003, American people were on his side. American people like leadership, they like bold action. It may be controversial. I mean, he's gonna catch hell no matter what he does, But he's got to do something.
Well, I know some of the military are against that whole process.
Well,
but it sounds like it's
constitution.
It's legal.
How many of
how many what?
How many of Lincoln's generals were on board with him?
Right.
And guess what? It was his leadership that won the Civil War. It wasn't the generals.
And who knows what the agenda is of those military leaders?
We got a lot of deep state generals.
We have a lot of leftovers.
Yep. I'm having questions about Mattis now. Everybody talked about what a great general he was. I'm having serious questions about Mattis now.
Yeah.
About his deep state involvement.
Might be some fluff in there.
Right, but he is the commander in chief of this United States, and he can tell these people what to do. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now.
And you got an option you can go statewide National Guard, or you could go with regular military.
Well, he can try them first, and if that don't work, I mean, who's to say you couldn't send a few Navy SEALs and Delta Force in there and have it taken 15 minutes,
Yep.
I mean, I'm not saying go in there and kill a bunch of people, but I think there's ways that they could isolate the leadership and take them out.
You're not dealing with pros in that category. You're dealing with amateurs.
You're dealing with amateurs.
They're well funded, but you're dealing with amateurs.
Right, obnoxious amateurs.
You send in professionals, and
And because I'm going to tell you, like I said in the beginning of the podcast, the American people are not on the side of the mob. Mm-hmm. They're on the side of law and order. That's what they want. And that's why I believe Trump will win in November, is because the Democrats are not giving them an option. You know, who wants what they're offering? Defunding the police, you know, just constant chaos, you know. And
so you mentioned to me earlier, the email is best for the White House.
That's what
they respond.
That's
better
what
to
the
that?
White House website said. It said email will get to him quicker than anything.
So
you know.
emailing Trump and asking for the Insurrection Act to be implemented.
Right. That's what I did. That's what I might, like I say, I may be wrong, but I think history is on his side. You know, strong action. Look at Lincoln. Lincoln did things that were unconstitutional. I'm not advocating he do something unconstitutional, but look at Lincoln today. We think of him as our greatest president. At the time he was in office, he was hated. I mean, he was one of the most hated presidents. You know, I don't know that you can be hated anymore, Donald Trump, but I think Lincoln was. You know, I mean,
at least Donald Trump was on the ballot.
Yeah,
in all states.
Yeah, Donald Trump was on the ballot in all the states. You know, Lincoln wasn't.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, yeah, you can't even make the argument that Trump is as hated as Lincoln because we don't have two separate countries over Trump.
Yeah, but I'll tell you what, I think the hatred is palpable as it was in Lincoln's time. I think right now, I think if somebody would lead, they could make a case for revolution. I'm not advocating revolution.
But the closest thing we got to secession so far is Chaz, and they still use the city's power.
Yeah. There you go. You know.
Just saying.
Yeah.
It's hard to say, hey, you're leaving the United States when you're like, you know, using the United States Wi-Fi.
Yeah. But anyway, we'll go ahead and close this thing up, and I appreciate everybody tuning in, and I hope you learned something tonight. Some of you. But anyway, I'm just trying to get across that I'm trying to get people to see that the Democratic Party has not changed that much from the days of Andrew Jackson to now. They're using the same tactics of divide and conquer. And more times than not, the Republican Party has been on the right side of history. They dropped the ball a couple times with the Compromise of 1877 and the Brownsville Affair under Theodore Roosevelt, but for the most part, they have been on the right side of history, and history will prove that. So, all right, well, thank you for tuning in tonight.
Yeah. Goodbye and good luck.